Hey, what's up guys? Today we're going to talk about the newest 5-star standard character, Yume Mizuki. Mizuki, also known as Mizuki. Mizuki is a 5-star anemo healer and on-field swirl driver or damage dealer who will increase your swirl damage while also triggering swirl and other chain reactions herself. And in today's video, we're going to cover everything you need to know about Mizuki, talking about her best builds, teams, weapons, artifacts, constellations, as well as the C0 showcase. Do excuse if my voice was different than usual at some parts as I'm recording this video as I'm still sick, but I'm starting to feel better. As always, before we begin, I want you guys to know that I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description if you're interested. With that being said, let's talk about Mizuki. Alright, so starting things off, what does Mizuki actually do? Firstly, Mizuki is an anemo catalyst, meaning that all of her normal charge and plunge attacks will be infused with anemo. With that said, the main part of her kit is her elemental skill. This is an ability where when pressed, it will first deal one instance of AoE anemo damage, and then she will enter the Dream Drifter state. Inside of this state, Mizuki will float around, constantly dealing AoE anemo damage to opponents at a set interval. In fact, this will be one instance of anemo damage every 0.75 seconds, with there being an ICD of 2 hits, meaning that you can trigger a swirl every other hit on a given enemy. Inside of this skill, you can control the way you're going, and you will also have a higher pickup distance of Mizuki's special snacks that she generates inside of her burst, which we'll talk about next. Outside of just that though, Mizuki will deal some damage that scales on her attack, but more crucially, she will increase the swirl damage of all of your party members, Mizuki herself included, based on how much elemental mastery she has. Now at talent level 9, this is 0.42% of her elemental mastery as a swirl damage increase, meaning that with 1000 elemental mastery, this will be 420%, and you can pretty easily get upwards of 1000 elemental mastery, provided you have EM main stats and an elemental mastery weapon, as Mizuki is a character who ascends with elemental mastery. With that said, keep in mind that because of the way swirl damage works and because of diminishing returns, you're not doing 420% more damage, but it is a lot of damage bonus to your swirl that will just make it do more damage based on your elemental mastery. Now, keep in mind that this buff is only active when you are inside of your skill, and this is an ability with a 15-second cooldown and effectively a 10-second duration. In fact, at a baseline, it says right here that the duration is 5 seconds, but through Mizuki's first passive, this will be increased by 2.5 seconds whenever Mizuki triggers a swirl inside of her skill up to a maximum of 2 times. Because Mizuki is going to be swirling, you will effectively have a 10-second duration on your skill where you can float around and constantly deal some anemo damage and swirl as much as possible. Keep in mind that inside of this elemental skill state, you will constantly be firing off these hits of anemo damage that will happen passively as your Mizuki is moving around, but you won't be able to unleash any normal or charge attacks on your Mizuki. It will just be skill damage, which can be a problem for certain teams and supports, but more on that later. Also, I wanted to mention that inside of your skill, you can dash around and try to avoid hits as you are inside of it, which is quite nice. Also note that your skill will end if you press it again or swap off Mizuki. Additionally, through Mizuki's second passive, inside of her elemental skill, Mizuki will also gain 100 elemental mastery, lasting for 4 seconds whenever other party members hit opponents with a swirlable element, namely either Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, or Electro, because this will basically always be the case in every Mizuki team you're playing, as we'll talk about later. This passive is effectively a free 100 elemental mastery to your Mizuki. Next up, for Mizuki's elemental burst, she will start by dealing a hit of anemo damage, while also pulling in nearby enemies. The grouping is nothing amazing, but it is one instance of pulling enemies close to you, which is an appreciated bonus. Outside of that, Mizuki will summon a mini Baku. This little summon will follow your active character, meaning it'll stay even if your Mizuki swaps out, and it will create special snacks nearby once every 1.5 seconds. Now, as you pick up a special snack, one of 2 things will happen. Firstly, if your character's active HP is 70% or lower, then it will heal them based on your Mizuki's elemental mastery, with it healing twice as much if it's Mizuki herself who's picking it up. This healing is single target and enough to sustain a character or self-sustain Mizuki herself, but nothing crazy, as we'll see shortly. Now, secondly, if your active character's HP is higher than 70%, instead of healing, it will explode and unleash a shockwave that will deal one instance of AoE anemo damage. This will give you a bit more damage, but also allow you to apply more anemo, get more swirls, and therefore deal more reaction damage. Now, personally, I do think that the restriction of not healing when you are above 70% HP is a bit annoying, but overall, this will just be more elemental application, as well as making your Mizuki a healer who will heal herself when she's on field, but also heal other party members even from off field, provided they pick up the snacks. This is an ability that will last for 12 seconds with a 15-second cooldown and a 60 energy cost. Now, before we talk about her playstyle and my overall thoughts on her as a character, and I do have a lot to say regarding her talent priority, you should first know that leveling her to 90 is essential to maximize her swirl damage, which is going to be the majority of her damage from off field. For those reasons, definitely level her up to 90, and then maximize your elemental skill, followed by your elemental burst. Both abilities are important to level, with your skill being especially important to increase the swirl damage increase you're getting from your skill, and your burst being nice to maximize your healing. Alright, now before we get into Mizuki's playstyle, let me quickly showcase her healing with my Mizuki at talent level 8 at just over 1000 elemental mastery. I have 1042 EM, and keep in mind that my healing will obviously be higher with higher talent levels and even more elemental mastery, but I'm on a 4-star weapon, full EM, and as you can see, I'm healing over 2700 when another party member picks up a snack, doubling that to over 5500 when Mizuki herself picks it up. For those reasons, while Mizuki's healing does have some drawbacks, like it is very single target, it is quite nice for self-sustaining Mizuki to constantly keep her healthy as she's floating inside of her skill, giving more healing to her than her other teammates. With that said, the snacks are definitely enough to heal your other party members if you swap to them and pick them up, but it is a bit more annoying, and with her healing mostly shining at keeping herself healthy or doing damage if you're above 70% HP, but more of my thoughts on that in the coming section. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about Mizuki's playstyle, how to get the most value out of her, as well as my thoughts and review on Mizuki as a character. Firstly, it's important to clarify that Mizuki's main role is going to be as an on-field Anemo driver, someone who will be floating around in her skill, constantly triggering swirls, as your off-field characters, supports or sub-DPSs, will constantly deal damage and apply the respective element, creating a mix of reactions that Mizuki will help enable by swirling, dealing increased swirl damage herself, while also buffing your team's damage through the Verdescent Venerer set. She is someone who is self-sufficient, as she'll be floating around inside of her skill, picking up the snacks that her burst generates, healing herself, and being very comfy and easy to play in the sense that you're literally just floating around and don't really have to do anything. Mizuki can also trigger chain reactions as someone who's stacking elemental mastery, being able to not only get damage out of her swirls that will be increased by her EM, but also trigger reactions such as electrocharged. With a lot of EM, will make it deal a decent amount of bonus damage that your Mizuki will be getting as she's on field, swirling a bunch of elements together. This is mostly going to be true in AoE, where you can swirl a bunch of different elements onto a bunch of different enemies, giving Mizuki a lot more value in AoE scenarios. On top of just that, swirl is a reaction that is better in AoE, as if you are swirling 2 or more enemies and they are close enough to each other, you can manage to deal twice as much damage to every enemy, swirling each enemy twice, allowing you to get twice as much damage. As you can see, each enemy will take 2 swirl hits at a time here, making Mizuki a character who gets better in AoE and quite a bit worse in single target. It is also worth noting that she's a character who will buff not just her personal swirl damage, but also all your swirl damage when she's inside of her skill. This means that if you're running another Anemo character like a Venti on your team, he will also deal more damage, which is kind of a niche thing, but it is unique to Mizuki, so it is worth mentioning as a bonus. Rotation wise, you want to set up your support characters, your other teammates' abilities first, using all their skills and bursts, and then swapping to your Mizuki and using her burst and her skill. You can also use Mizuki's burst earlier in your rotation if you want to trigger the Verdescent Venerer set, but once you swap into her, you just press your skill, float around, and trigger swirls. She is someone who wants field time. She's not just a off-field support, she's really an on-field swirling character. Now, with that in mind, another technically viable playstyle is one where you just use her for her burst, run Verdescent Venerer and maybe a supportive weapon like Thrilling Tales, buff your team, get some healing, and swap out. While this is technically viable, it will be a playstyle where she's just a worse Jean, but it is worth mentioning it's just not going to be the main focus of this guide, as it's not what she's designed around and not how I recommend playing her. Now, things I want to point out are the following. Firstly, healing wise, Mizuki is best described as self-sufficient, a character that can very easily keep herself healthy, but isn't the most efficient at healing your other party members. Because of this, she has a bit of anti-healing with Frina, although a lot of her teams end up running Frina anyways, because she's generally just your best Hydra option and still an amazing character, but more on that in the team section later. Also, Mizuki not being able to attack in her skill is annoying. As I said, it ruins her synergy with characters like Xingqiu or Yelan, and even someone like Beidou, characters who are all great in electrocharged or taser focused teams, which are some of Mizuki's best teams. Not being able to normal attack gives you annoying team restrictions, especially when you're looking for Hydra options, as not being able to use Xingqiu or Yelan means you either need to run Frina or a slower Hydra applier like Kokomi or Mona, but they obviously won't give you quite as much damage. Mizuki does have some other teams though outside of just electrocharge, as she can be ran with any off-field supports or sub DPSs of the swirlable elements, with an aggravate team being another solid option. Now, as far as her value as a character goes, I will say the following. While I've seen a lot of people doom post her, I want to be honest and say that evaluating her as a standard character and as a limited character are two different things. As a limited character, I would not recommend pulling on the banner. Mizuki is not nearly as good as the best limited 5 stars or even just the average ones, and I wouldn't consider her valuable as a limited character, but as a standard character, obviously you have to evaluate her differently. And as a standard 5 5-star, she can be decent. While she's obviously not game-breaking or someone you need, and there definitely are a ton of other on-fielder options for the teams she's played in, including even strong 4-star characters. If you get her from the standard banner, losing a 50-50, or even from the 5-star selector that we will be getting every anniversary, she is a character who has use cases. She is basically going to be an on-field Anemo driver, similarly to an on-field Sucrose. While Sucrose has the potential to be used as an off-field support as well, and also has an elemental mastery buff to your whole team, on top of also being able to use normal attacks for characters like Xingqiu, Yelan, or Beidou, what Mizuki gives you is healing, self-sustain, and a comfy, sort of brain-off playstyle. Mizuki will also deal more swirl damage, and Mizuki is a character who I think is okay. You can get value with her if you have good off-field supports that are built well, and your Mizuki is on-field, driving everything, swirling everything, and providing you with some healing. Again, she's not an amazing character, but with that said, the current Abyss is kind of criminally terrible for Mizuki. It's all a bunch of single target stuff with certain restrictions, and just from patch notes alone, we know that the next Abyss will have a swirl buff and be more AoE focused, so it may be more Mizuki propaganda, but keep in mind that this Abyss is particularly bad for her, and in AoE situations, she definitely does a lot better than in single target because of how her kit and the swirl reaction works. Outside of that, I also wanted to mention that for a strength of Mizuki, she definitely does have good constellations for a standard character. While I'll cover these later in the constellation section, it is worth pointing out that her second constellation is one that will give a damage bonus similar to Kazuha's when you are on field inside of your skill. Now this damage bonus has some restrictions, which again I'll cover, like needing to be on field and not being snapshotable, but it is a really considerable team-wide buff, meaning that Mizuki does get quite a bit better with certain constellations. Overall though, I do believe that if you're just someone who cares about meta, Mizuki is someone who will feel underwhelming. She's a character who has a lot of weaknesses that I've covered and restrictions that can be annoying to play around. With that in mind, she does have a sort of comfy playstyle that I do think some new players or people who just enjoy that playstyle or really just like the character might enjoy, and so this video will naturally focus on how to get the most value out of Mizuki. I want to be honest in my review, and while I don't think she's great as a character, as a standard 5-star, there's definitely a lot of teams that can be made around her, and so I don't want to treat this character unfairly, as if you like her, while she isn't the strongest, you definitely can still get a lot of value, especially in AoE, out of teams that focus around either strong reactions or strong characters, with Mizuki just being an on-field driver, enabling your off-field sub-DPS's off-field supports to do as much damage as they can. Yes, other characters can work on-field in teams like this, there are many that exist, but Mizuki is an option that is more designed around comfort, self-healing, and just floating around. Mizuki is also someone who I think will get better as future characters are released, off-field sub-DPS's that can synergize with her kit, on top of also getting better with constellations, which you may get if you lose 50-50. Now, I really want to leave it at that though. I've been re-recording this part so many times to try to explain the nuance of, yes, she's not a great character, and I want to be honest that she has a lot of weaknesses that frankly I wish she didn't, but I also don't want to unfairly like jump on a bandwagon hating on a character who I think can have use cases as a standard banner 5-star, especially if you either like her or don't have access to the most on-field options. And so I'm gonna leave it at that. I wanted to give you guys an honest review in this video as well, so that you know what to expect from this character. For the most part though, this is a guide and build video, so we're gonna focus on how to optimize your Mizuki and really get the most out of her. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about how to actually build your Mizuki. Firstly, for your artifact sets, it is very straightforward. It should be no surprise to you by now if you've built other Anemo supports or have just watched this channel before that the Viridescent Venerer 4-piece is just the go-to artifact set. This is true for basically any Anemo support, and Mizuki is no exception. What this set does is firstly decrease the elemental resistance of any element you swirl, meaning that any of the elemental sub DPSs or off-field supports, damage dealers that you're running will deal more damage as you swirl their corresponding element of either Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, or Electro with your Mizuki. On top of just that though, it will also give her more damage through the form of both a Nemo damage bonus and, more importantly, a swirl damage increase on the 4-piece, which is quite relevant to Mizuki. For those reasons, this set is going to be your best in slot option overall, giving you more personal damage and especially more team damage. Now, with that said, if you don't need the Viridescent Venerer set, for example, maybe you have it on another Anemo character in a double Anemo team, then going for a set that increases your elemental mastery significantly, like notably the Gilded Dream set or mix and matching 2 pieces of EM sets, can be viable as well. Overall though, Viridescent Venerer is typically your go-to, as it will give you swirl damage and also shredding resistances of whatever you're swirling to maximize your team's overall damage. Next up, for the stats you're looking for on Mizuki, once again, it is very straightforward. Because virtually every part of your kit scales with elemental mastery, it is the main stat you're going to be looking for. In fact, not only will elemental mastery increase the damage you're dealing through reactions such as swirl and other chain reactions you may trigger such as electrocharged, but also you will gain more swirl damage through your skill, once again based on how much elemental mastery you have, while also increasing how much you heal. Most of your kit scales on elemental mastery outside of just some personal damage numbers, which is why it is the primary stat you're looking for, as it increases both your healing and reaction damage. The only other stat you're typically going to look for on top of elemental mastery is energy recharge. Energy recharge is nice to use your burst as often as you need it, being nice to use not only for comfort, but also just to get some more damage, heal your Mizuki, and also synergize with Farina. For those reasons, if you want to burst every rotation, you can usually need around 150 to 160 energy recharge, but obviously the exact amount will vary based on your team. Note that your energy recharge requirements can be quite a bit higher or lower depending on your teammates and rotation length. Generally though, this is a solid range to go for, and if you end up needing too much energy recharge in a given team, then using your burst every other rotation is fine as well, unless you really need the healing, but generally speaking, you don't need that much ER, with around 150 to 160 being a general range. A typical Mizuki build will be going for elemental mastery on her sands, goblet, and circlet, and for your substats, you look for energy recharge and elemental mastery wherever you can get it. Energy recharge can also be a viable main stat for your sands, but typically you can get enough by looking for it on your substats. Additionally, if you are running the Favonius Codex, then crit rate becomes a nice stat as well, as either a substat or a main one on your circlet. Generally speaking though, Mizuki is very easy to build, and just as long as you have enough elemental mastery, and ideally some energy recharge as well, you can start getting value out of this character without needing the most insane substats. Next up, for Mizuki's best weapons, once again it is quite straightforward. As we saw in the last section, Mizuki is a character who values elemental mastery, and for her weapons, it's pretty much the same. In fact, you will either be going for a catalyst that gives Mizuki as much elemental mastery as possible, or you'll be going for a supportive option. Firstly, your signature weapon, Sunny Morning Sleep In, is a weapon that just gives an insane amount of elemental mastery. In fact, when you combine all the EM you get from the effect on top of the very high main stat that it has, you can get a bit over 500 elemental mastery, which is quite a lot. So while I personally am not the biggest fan of this weapon banner, if you do get it, then you can definitely use it on your Mizuki as the weapon that will give you the most elemental mastery overall. Although keep in mind that some supportive weapons that we'll talk about later may give you more team damage, more benefits to your overall team than just elemental mastery on Mizuki, but more on that shortly. Outside of that, Sitlali's signature weapon will give you 365 EM, even though the buffing effect is wasted on Mizuki as she can't create a shield, so I'd much rather use this weapon on someone like Sitlali or Lanyan if you have them, but still this is a solid EM stat stick for Mizuki. Outside of that, Nahida's weapon can be good as well, giving you a lot of elemental mastery and also 40 EM for your party, which is a small buff that can add up if your other characters are also triggering reactions. Moving on for the 4-star options, I want to first talk about the Wandering Ebon Star, which is a 4-star weapon that you can only get when it's featured on weapon banners, but if you have it, it is solid. This is because it will give your Mizuki elemental mastery while also converting it to a attack buff for your entire party. This is therefore a nice weapon that gives you both some elemental mastery and also some buffs, giving your team attack percent and getting better with refinement. So if you do have it, especially refined, it can be a great option. While elemental mastery is very nice on Mizuki, giving your off-field damage dealers some attack can definitely be valuable as well, so don't sleep on this weapon if you have it, especially with refinements. Outside of that, other easily accessible EM stat sticks work quite nicely. Sacrificial Fragments is the standard go-to 4-star, giving you over 200 elemental mastery. Magic Guide is also a viable 3-star if you don't have sac frags, giving you less EM but being very easy to level. Outside of that, Fruit of Fulfillment is a free-to-play craftable weapon that will give you 180 EM through its effect at R5, on top of also getting 45% energy recharge, so if you have the prototypes for it, it can be solid if you need both energy recharge and elemental mastery. It won't give you quite as much elemental mastery as a weapon like sac frags though, so keep that in mind. Generally though, any of these EM stat sticks work as a solid choice for Mizuki. Now outside of that, more supportive weapons can work depending on the situation. Firstly, Favonius Codex can be a great option if your team needs more energy, as not only will it give ER to Mizuki, but also through its effect, it will allow her to generate more energy for her entire team. This is a weapon that gets better with refinement, and it is worth pointing out that because Mizuki will be on field, it will allow her to trigger it more than once in a rotation, which gives the weapon more value, provided you're building at least a little bit of crit rate on your substats. Keep in mind though that this is a weapon that I would only recommend if your team values the energy that it gives you. Outside of that, the Hokushin Ring can also be good in teams with Electro characters like Electrocharge or Aggravate. This is a free-to-play craftable weapon that you can get to R5 for free, and giving elemental damage bonus to your Electro party members and potentially even other party members, provided your Mizuki can trigger a reaction such as Electrocharged or Aggravate and increase, for example, your Hydro or Dendro damage bonus on top of your Electro one, can make this weapon get a lot of value. Once again, you don't get any elemental mastery, but the damage bonus you get makes it viable in Electro heavy teams. teams. Overall, I think Hakushin's buff can be really good in teams with an Electro character, so an underrated weapon that can be really good as far as buffing your team goes and overall team damage. So a great option that I can recommend. Additionally, Prototype Amber is another weapon I wanted to mention that doesn't have good stats for Mizuki, but will instead give her some energy on the effect and crucially give her some healing to all of your party members as well. This is a weapon that is viable in teams with Furina if your Mizuki doesn't have enough healing herself to fully stack up your Furina's fanfare. Keep in mind that if you are using this weapon, you definitely want to craft 5 copies of it and refine it all the way to R5. Lastly, if you're wondering why I haven't mentioned Thrilling Tales, it's because this is mostly a supportive weapon for off-fielders that doesn't really synergize well for an on-field Mizuki where she's on-field doing as much reaction damage as she can. It also doesn't really line up well with most of your rotations, but I'm sure there are some weird niche cases where it is usable. It's just not recommended for optimal playstyle. I would really only mention this in a support playstyle where you're not running Mizuki on field, just using her burst and swapping out. But again, this isn't the recommended playstyle. It's not the point of this guide, but I did want to at least mention it. And so overall, Mizuki's weapon choices are very straightforward, with EM stat sticks being good and supportive weapons being, in my opinion, very powerful choices to give your team more damage. So don't sleep on weapons such as the Favonius Codex or the Hakushin Ring for a lot of value in the form of either energy with Fav or damage bonus with Hakushin, either of which being potentially the best options for you. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Mizuki's Constellations. Now keep in mind that as a standard banner character, you might be getting her Constellations long term as you inevitably lose 50/50s or choose her from the standard selector. For those reasons, Constellations on a standard character can be quite important if you plan on playing for a long time. So firstly, for Mizuki's first Constellation, this is one that will give her quite a bit more personal damage. In fact, when Mizuki is inside of her skill, she will continuously apply a certain effect to enemies every 3.5 seconds. When an opponent with said effect gets swirled, the swirl that you do will remove this effect from the opponents and have its damage increased by 1100% of Mizuki's elemental mastery. What this means in practice is that basically every 3.5 seconds in your skill, you will just do one really big swirl that will do much more damage. Your EM scaling is a lot higher, and because swirl is an AoE reaction, this can be even more damage in AoE content if you're swirling multiple enemies at the same time. Because your skill lasts for 10 seconds, you should be able to trigger this effect up to 3 times, and it will be a nice increase in personal damage. Now keep in mind that the supports in your Mizuki team, your sub DPSs, will be doing a lot of damage as well, so increasing Mizuki's damage, while it is definitely nice, isn't the only thing you care about. But honestly, as a first Constellation for a standard character, this is quite nice to increase your Mizuki's personal damage, especially in AoE, as it just will give you one much stronger swirl up to 3 times in your skill. Next up, for the most impressive Constellation in my opinion, Mizuki's second Constellation will increase your team's Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, and Electro damage bonus by 0.04% of her elemental mastery inside of her elemental skill. This buff will last till her skill ends, and the scaling on this second Constellation is actually the same as Kazuha's Ascension 4 passive, so it is a good buff. For example, if you have 1000 elemental mastery, which is very achievable with an elemental mastery weapon, you will be giving all of your party members a 40% damage bonus to all 4 of the swirlable elements. This means that any sub DPS or off-field support you're running will be getting buffed and will therefore do more damage consistently. Now, the one thing you need to keep in mind with this Constellation is that because the buff is only applied when you're inside your Mizuki skill, so on field with her, you can't really snapshot this buff, so it might lose value with some snapshotting characters like a Fischl skill or a Shangling Pyronado that you'll have to use before you swap into Mizuki. With that in mind though, for most support characters that don't snapshot, and even just in general, it is a solid increase to your party's damage, at least their off-field abilities that are constantly doing damage as you're on field on your Mizuki. So that is something you need to keep in mind. It does have the restriction of only buffing your party members when you're on field inside of your skill on Mizuki, but overall it is a solid buff, and honestly one that will make Mizuki quite a bit more valuable. Moving on, Mizuki's C3 and C5 increase her talent levels, which is nice, notably her C3 for more swirl damage, but not the biggest deal. And then Mizuki's C4 is one that allows her burst to deal damage and heal at the same time. On top of this, because every snack you pick up is dealing damage and healing, you should be able to heal above 70% HP, which is honestly really nice because it can help you stack up your Furina better and just heal your team more efficiently, on top of also giving some energy to Mizuki, up to 20 per burst, which is just nice overall. More consistent healing, damage, and anemo application through your snacks, while also giving you energy, being a decent constellation for comfort and quality of life. Now lastly, for Mizuki's C6, this will allow swirls from Mizuki or other party members to crit when she's inside of her elemental skill. So when you're inside of your skill, your swirls can crit with their crit rate fixed at 30% and the crit damage fixed at 100. This is obviously going to be a pretty solid DPS increase to your Mizuki swirls, and potentially another anemo character if they're swirling while your Mizuki's on field. This is a constellation that may remind you of Nahida's C2, but obviously it's not as broken. It's just more damage to your swirls. So 30% crit rate, 100% crit damage on swirls when you're inside of your skill. Pretty nice overall. And so overall, as a standard character, I do kind of like her constellations because again, you might get them eventually, and having quite a few that will increase her personal damage, one that helps her quality of life, and her second one giving her a pretty big buff to 4 different elements is honestly very much appreciated. Now obviously I can't recommend pulling on her limited banner for these, but as a standard character, pretty good, especially her C2. Alright, now next up, let's talk about Mizuki's best synergies and best team comps overall. Now firstly, it's important to re-emphasize that Mizuki is a character who relies on swirling. As a healer and an emo character and on-field driver, you want to be running her with off-field characters of elements that can be swirled, typically synergizing around a specific reaction. Now firstly, a lot of Mizuki's teams will run electro characters. As far as electro characters go, there are really so many that can work. You can run Auroron, Fischl, Yae Miko, or even Lisa, and they all can give you solid off-field presence, electro application, damage, and potentially even buffs through like the hero set with Auroron or Lisa's Death Shred. A character like Kugi can also work, but keep in mind that Mizuki already will self-heal, so Kugi's extra healing is not typically as needed. In a lot of Mizuki's best teams, you'll run 1 or 2 electro characters in a team that is focused on either electro charge or aggravate. While there are some other reactions we'll talk about too, to start things off, firstly, electro charge teams are very nice for an on-field Anemo driver, as you can swirl both electro and hydro, increasing the damage of both your electro and also your hydro damage dealers, swirling a bunch of elements together, being especially great in AoE, and allowing your Mizuki, who's building full EM, to trigger both swirl and electro charge and deal damage that way. For those reasons, you can run any of the electro characters I mentioned earlier, 1 or 2 of them, and then you also want a hydro character in this team. The best option for a hydro character in general with Mizuki is going to be Furina. As mentioned previously, you can't run Sanctuary Elan because Mizuki won't use normal attacks, and Furina, while she does have some anti-synergy with Mizuki's healing, which is very single target and doesn't work above 70% HP, and while Furina doesn't increase Mizuki's swirl damage, what Furina does is still incredible in the sense of good hydro application, good personal damage, and also a team-wide damage buff that sure won't buff your swirl damage, but will be applied to all of your other off-field sub DPSs that will be doing a lot of damage, on top of Furina also buffing herself. For other off-field hydro units, you can run someone like Kokomi or Mona, Kokomi giving you more healing and Mona giving you some damage, but they both don't give you as much hydro application or damage as Furina does, so they aren't as recommended. Outside of that, you can also run Mizuki in a variation of an electro charge team known as Soup, one where you're just mixing a bunch of elements together, usually running an electro, a hydro, and a pyro character, and just getting a bunch of different reactions together. You can run someone like Mawika for great damage, or Shangling, although she'll need a lot of energy recharge. Keep in mind that while a lot of Soup teams like to run Bennett, he won't be as recommended here as Furina doesn't scale with attack, and Mizuki doesn't care about it too much either, so Bennett would really only be buffing 1 electro character here, which is okay, but not ideal. Outside of that, you can also run Mizuki in an aggravate team, where I do think she works quite nicely. In a team like this, you will be swirling electro constantly, triggering reactions on your Mizuki, while also allowing your off-field electro units to be buffed and deal as much damage as possible. You'll run 2 electro characters here, any of the strong ones I mentioned earlier, while also running a strong off-field Dendro. Nahida will be the best option, giving your Mizuki elemental mastery through her burst, while also applying a ton of Dendro and having really good personal damage. And so I have enjoyed aggravate teams quite a bit with Mizuki. Outside of that, you can also run burning teams with either Nahida or Emily as your 2 best Dendro options, and virtually any pyro character you have that can apply pyro from off-field. And in a team like this, your last slot will be flexible. Additionally, you can also run a Hyperbloom team with Mizuki as the on-field driver. Because Mizuki is stacking elemental mastery, as long as you can make sure that her swirls are hitting the Dendro cores, then she can Hyperbloom for a lot of damage. You just want to run an electro character here, an off-field hydro support, and a Dendro one as well. The Dendro and hydro options can be pretty much anyone provided they have enough application, and the electro character doesn't even need to be someone on elemental mastery like Kuki. It could just be someone like Fischl, provided that, once again, your Mizuki will be the one triggering Hyperbloom, triggering the cores by swirling the electro that your support is applying onto the cores, allowing your Mizuki who's on full EM to also get Hyperbloom damage. I also wanted to point out though that Mizuki can be ran in double Anemo teams, particularly against AoE content where enemies can be displaced or at least will group up naturally. In a team like this, a second Anemo like Kazuha, Venti, or Sucrose can work for more swirls and potentially even allow your burning to do some AoE as well, which does actually work if the enemies are close enough together. Because Mizuki will buff your whole team's swirl damage when she's in her skill, a second Anemo character can work in various different teams, but keep in mind that this is more restricted to content where enemies can be grouped up and a lot lot worse in single target. Outside of that, Mizuki can be ran with any generic reaction. You can run her with strong units just like Mawika and Sidlali, get some melts, and it'll work because these characters are so broken and have some off-field presence as well. You can also run Mawika and Farina and get Vapes that way. You can run an AFK Archon team where you're just floating around, or other variations of Vaporize with Farina and Xiangling, which will work as well. Overall though, as far as teams go, you really can play just any off-field supports that are of these swirlable elements, as Mizuki is an Anemo on-fielder who's also a healer. Personally, my favorite teams have been both Aggravate and Electrocharge teams, mostly because of how strong certain Electro off-fielders can be. Now, while typically I would include a DPS showcase of my Mizuki or a team in this video, the Abyss kind of just reset and all the information and everything in this video is done, and I don't want to delay it longer than it's already been delayed. So while I've included showcase throughout the video, what I will add here is the following. Firstly, the last Abyss was kind of unfair for Mizuki, and there's a lot of Abysses that are very single target and really restrictive, and this Abyss I think kind of swings the pendulum the other way and overcompensates by buffing Swirl and making it what I assume to be quite AoE on the first half, making Mizuki a lot stronger here. So what I will say is that her strength in certain combat will vary. It'll look better or look worse depending on what you're doing, what the Abyss rotation is, or the content you choose to clear. I will reiterate that last Abyss was particularly painful to test her in because of what it was, and I do look forward to playing her in this new Abyss, which I will be doing on my live stream literally tonight. And so that's about it for this video. Apologies for the delay, I've been very sick, but I'm feeling better and we'll be ready full force for 5.5. Overall though, it was a bit troubling to give my thoughts on Mizuki in a condensed form in this video. I hope I did a good job, but with that said, I want to leave it there and stop my yapping. So I hope you enjoyed the guide. If there's anything you want to add, it will be in a pinned comment because she's a new character. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.